Welcome to Conducting an Effective Job Interview. My name is Dante St. James. I just slowed over that. Job interview. I'm Dante St. James. We're going to look at the best ways and techniques to get yourself prepared for a job interview, conducting the actual interview, and then the more important follow-up you have on the end. Let's share that screen and we'll get it underway. This webinar is brought to you by the Australian Small Business Advisory Services Digital Solutions Program. And before we get underway, I'd like to really look at this great little quote from Yogi Berra, a great baseball player and coach. Before you build a better mousetrap, it helps to know if there are any mice out there. Let's see that this is what we're going to look at today is conducting an effective hiring interview by preparing for the interview, looking at the right questions to ask up front, doing the interview, and assessing the applicant in the interview as well. This is brought to you by Business Station and the Australian Small Business Advisory Services Digital Solutions Program. I'm going to spit that out correctly one day. It's going to be so smooth and simple. And it's also brought to you by the Australian government in conjunction with Regional Development Australia, Brisbane, and our friends at Treaty Business Consulting in the Northern Territory, where I happen to be representing today. This will be available again on YouTube a little bit later on, but you'll also be able to see this on my own YouTube channel through Dante St. James or through the Business Station one. Just search for Business Station on YouTube and you'll see a range of amazing webinars that have been designed especially for small businesses just like you. Bit about me. My name is Dante St. James. I've been producing a lot of content for Facebook lately. I did a big Facebook conference early this morning online for Google's Digital Springboard project, the Australian government's Be Connected and NICE programs, as well as the ASBAS Digital Solution Program. My education coming from the Chartered Institute of Marketing, University of New South Wales, and New South Wales TAFE, as well as being part of Facebook's Lead Trainer program. Now, a bit of an introduction when it comes to this is how to get started on the whole hiring process. The opportunity here is that a job interview is a tool for matching the best possible applicant to the role that they're going to fill. That is a huge and unique opportunity. And quite often they're filling the shoes of someone who previously held that role, who have left very big shoes to fill indeed. So approach your interview as being a really great opportunity to look way beyond just the idea of filling a role, but matching the best possible person to that role so that they can be hanging around for long enough to really make a difference in that role. But it does take some attention before the interview, during the interview process, and especially after the interview where a lot of things can get dropped. It's not just a matter of turning up to an interview and having a chat. It's about being very well prepared before it, doing the right questions during it, and then the right level of assessment after it. So first up, we're going to look at preparing for the interview itself. This is before anyone stepped in the door. We want to review the current job description for the role that you're trying to fill. What this means is that you're able to ensure that you've got the right person filling the right job because you've asked the right questions of them. And there are many questions you're going to need to ask. First of all, though, you have to ask yourself, what are the must-haves of this role? What are the things they simply are not negotiable, must have in order to have the minimum requirements to fulfill this particular role? If they were a doctor, they need a medical degree and registration with the medical board, right? If they were a plumber, they need to be a licensed plumber who has not just experience, but the licenses and the qualifications to do that particular job. Likewise, anybody in any role anywhere will have a certain degree of minimum requirements to be able to do that job, whether it's basic understanding of the English language or high-level HTML coding skills. Then secondly, you need to ask yourself, what are the responsibilities of this role? So what exactly does this person actually have to achieve in order to fulfill all the things that they are supposed to fulfill as part of that job? Do they have to fill out attendance records? Do they have to complete building a website? Do they have to take calls and note those in place? Is there a minimum set of things they have to do in order to fulfill all the responsibilities for that role that they have to fulfill? Then what are the nice to haves? These are the things where we go, you know what? It'd be nice if this person also knew how to mail merge in Microsoft Excel. Or it could be nice for them to know how to do live video on a Facebook portal device. Or it might be Nice to know that they know how to use Canva in order to be able to get our social media property looking better. And then finally, what are you willing to provide training in? What are the things that are either must-haves or the responsibilities or the nice-to-haves that if they don't have those things, that you're able to train them with? And this is not just the fact that you're able to train them, that you'll have the time to train them. When the funny thing happens, when especially when you're early in a new business, when you're at that point where you're hiring a first person and you're thinking, great, this first person is going to take so much relief for me. It's going to make life so much easier to be able to cope with. The problem is that if you're in if you're in a problem where you have a an issue with someone who has a very core part of their role they don't know how to do, then what you may need to do is actually spend so much time training that you have to remove yourself from your position and job to help them to get trained to do their position and job. The problem being there is no work's getting done. If it's just you and that new person and you're training them, every minute you're training them is time away from you getting work done, which means it's time away from your customers being served, or it's time away from projects being completed. So you need to factor for that. So willing to not only provide the training, but provide the time away from actually working to do that training. Now, a lot of on-the-job training sort of covers that. You're working on the problems as they come in or working on the projects as they come in with that new staff member. But for some very specific things, you may need to pull yourself and themselves out of the business altogether to do some very dedicated, very specific training on a very specific system or task. The candidate, though, they are in the background while you're doing all your preparation, using the job description as a base. What this means is that you really need to understand that job description really well. In fact, better than you, because they're probably going to be reading into it to understand your company culture. They're going to be reading into it to understand, what they need to answer and how they need to answer it. They're going to reading it. They're going to be more prepared for this interview than you are if you haven't read that job description thoroughly and understood what it's all about. They may know the job description better than you, which means that you will be caught off guard rather than they being caught off guard. Not that you're trying to catch anyone off guard here, but what you are trying to do is to show some sort of confidence so that the person who is being interviewed understands that they're coming into a solid workplace with solid processes and a boss who cares. We don't want to step into any job where we feel like we won't be nurtured, cared for, or some way looked after. So that's what we must need mostly, is the ability to be able, excuse me, oh, it's a big cough there. I have to understand that that candidate will probably know the job role better than you do. So you really need to get yourself up to speed. Also, before they walk into the door, make sure that you've read the resume thoroughly so you understand who you are interviewing. There are a few things more embarrassing than you asking a question that was answered clearly in their resume or on their cover letter. Asking, oh, where are you from? They're like, dude, have you not read my resume? It says I'm from Sydney. That sort of thing just makes someone feel not confident. Now, just remember too, you may be interviewing them, but they're also interviewing you. So you've got to come across with a level of confidence and ability that shows them they can feel safe going for a job with you, and they won't be suddenly just sort of dumped off or somehow, turned into a mess just because they didn't quite follow some procedure that you hadn't even actually lined up for them. So make sure you do read that resume thoroughly so that you understand what's going on. And in that resume, you're looking for things like questions around their previous roles. If you see something that doesn't quite sit right, if it doesn't quite sit where you think it's going to sit, if it doesn't quite match what your expectations were, or if it stands out in some way about their previous role, then look at those and jot that down as a question that you may need to ask to ensure that you've got the ability to be able to ask that question and let them know that it's something that you have a concern about. Look forward look for questions rather around gaps. If there's gaps in their job history, gaps in their skills, gaps that you thought should be fulfilled and they shouldn't really have that gap in there, that's when you're going to look around for things that don't really make sense and probably need explaining a bit more. Things like, for instance, starting off a degree and not finishing it. Having a 3-year gap in their job history within Australia may mean they were traveling. It could mean they're also studying. So look for those gaps and ask some questions around it. Then also look for the things like their interests and their hobbies. People have some very diverse interests and hobbies. A lot of them will just say interests are house, garden, kids, but you're looking for things that go a little bit beyond that. You're looking for things that indicate a personality or some kind of extra skills maybe that add to them. For example, if someone's volunteering for the local baseball club, then they've got an interest in administrative stuff. So they have obviously an eye for detail and probably have some leadership potential in there as well. If they're coaching a kids basketball team, then that's also adding another element of leadership and trainability or training ability as well. Those little things around interests and hobbies will provide lots more information around, what this person is like, who they are, and what they're most likely to bring to your business, aside from just the skills and experience they've described in their resume. Interests are interesting for you. Make sure you read into them. And also look for questions around the certain moves they've made in their life. I've made a lot of moves in my life because my previous career took me around to lots of different places. I originally grew up in Sydney, moved to Queensland at some point in 1996, back to Sydney, back to Queensland in 2000. From there, I ended up in 2003 in Darwin. Then 2008, I ended up in Hobart and Perth. Then it was back to Darwin, back to Melbourne, up to Darwin again, down to Queensland, from Queensland right through to about 2017 when I returned to Darwin. Now, those different moves are related to a little bit of business move, a little bit of educational move, relationship moves, those kind of moves. Just ask them to explain what those moves were for. Because sometimes all that sort of moving can indicate a very unstable character and an unstable person. In my case, this just meant that was my next step in my career had to take me to other places. So I had to go to other places to get those next steps. In some people's cases, it could be they don't have an adequate answer for that. They go, I just moved for a relationship, and they move for a relationship every 2 years. There's a very good chance they'll move for a relationship again. In the case of where they might be military husbands or wives, or perhaps police husbands and wives, moves can be expected because that comes with a very transient role like that. Also, before they even walk in the door, allow enough time so that you're not rushed or vital questions aren't skipped. The problem with when you rush for things before that, you start to go, okay, I'm going to skip this question, skip this question. You're not giving other people a chance to get their words in either. Before that person even gets close to walking in the door, you must allow enough time so that you're not rushed or that vital questions aren't just glossed over in order to get the thing done. That means your interview is going to take you longer than 10 minutes. You're going to need to allow longer than 20 minutes usually. It may take half an hour to an hour to get that done. But it's not just about making room for that interview, it's all the stuff around it as well. You need to allow time for all the participants in the interview to have their say, not just you, not just the candidate, but also the others who are in there as well, whether they're colleagues, whether they're friends you brought in to be part of the process, whether they're other managers or other people that person will be reporting to. You need to have adequate time for all your questions, then all their questions, and also time to familiarize yourself with the situation. Look for body language, look for the mood that person may be in, and that will help you to guide what questions you may want to ask and how open they may be to answering some of the curlier questions as well. But you also want to, because you may have been a week since you last read that resume, it may have been a week since you last read the job description. So take the time in the preparation for the meeting, even when you've walked in and you're giving yourself 5 minutes to familiarize yourself, to review everything, preview everything with the other participants in the interview before the candidate walks in, so that you can have a bit of a strategy to go forward with. So you understand that, okay, I'm going to ask these questions. What have you got? You got that? Okay, I'll drop this from my list so you can ask that. Everyone's going to have their own approach to this. Some are going to be more prepared than others. For those who are very prepared and have their questions in advance, this is a chance for you to not be going over and repeating the questions they have, or saying, no, I really need to ask this question in my way. I prefer if you don't ask that question. When you have a divided approach within the interview, it creates an awkward environment that then you're going to have problems with that person trusting your company or your business, or understanding you have any sort of unity in your team at all. Then allow time at the end for your initial thoughts to be shared with the other participants, with the other interviewers. So to make sure that you're all on the same page, where you might go, that answer she gave about moving so many times, I found that really interesting and a little disturbing. What about you guys? And then someone else might say, actually, no, she explained that really clearly. She said blah, 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 blah. And you go, oh, I missed that. What it allows you to do is to compare notes so that you actually understand that you all heard the same things and someone didn't get a very different, vastly out there perception of what the candidate was answering. So when you allow time at the end for these kinds of thoughts, you're allowing time at the end for a lot of sanity to come into the process, for a lot of ability for people to then go clarifying things, clarifying why you asked that question, and then planning and preparing for the next interview. Because quite often we have these things back to back where we're taking almost a whole day or half a day out to interview certain candidates. But one of the major reasons you want to allow this time is to allow time for the candidate to ask questions. So they've got the ability to be able to ask you the things they need to know about your business. They might want to ask about the pay rate. They may want to ask about the hours. They may want to ask about the terms of employment, whether it's for a contract or for a long permanent position. Are they asking, for instance, for information about where they will be working? Is it a work from home job? Is it a job where they'll be working from a specific office in a location next to you? Are they actually working from your home? And they might have questions around occupational health and safety around, well, if I'm working from your home, is your home actually set up to actually have staff in it? Because I've worked from someone's home before. It was really weird and awkward and filthy, and I wouldn't want to put myself in that position again. They are very valid and very wise questions for a candidate to be asking. So you do want to make sure you allow time for all your participants to have their say. Allow time at the start of the interview before the person walks in to familiarize yourself again with the questions that are being asked by each of the interviewers, and also the questions you want to ask, and also referring to the resume again to get some fresh insights just before the interview. Allow time at the end for all the interviewers to discuss what they initially thought before you go into a full assessment. And then also allow time for the candidate to ask the questions they need to ask in order to understand what their next steps will be. Now we move on to what the right questions are to ask. And this is really important because we can often get caught up and taken and derailed off of the other directions with questions that really don't matter or questions that made no difference at all. What we want to do now is make sure the questions we've got are the questions that are going to get the answers that you need to base your decisions off in the best possible way. So before each interview, make sure you have your list of questions ready to go. So each one of your candidates is fairly compared. There's no point asking just 3 questions of one candidate and 32 questions of another candidate. It's unfair to both those candidates because one was under interviewed, the other one may have been over interviewed. Try to keep it to a happy medium. If you do have to skip a particular question due to time, make sure it's a question of, that you would like to have asked but wasn't vitally important. Have your priority questions so that you've got one set of questions that absolutely must be asked of each candidate every time, and then have your additional bonus round questions, I guess, that give you a little bit more deeper insight into that person or personality traits or their skills and experience. So there's a bunch of different question types that we will cover off. There's what we call open-ended questions. There are self-appraisal questions, accomplishment questions, broad brush questions, and comparison questions. Each one of these types of questions has an example that I'm going to go through. And I've actually got quite a few examples in there that will really help you to understand what they mean. But it's important during every interview to ask all of these different kinds of questions because they provide very different levels of information and very different levels of that sort of unspoken, almost physical answer, where you're not necessarily being told exactly like a hot or cold, yes or no, black or white answer. You're getting something that indicates something further that you may want to probe a bit further down if there's a line of questioning that may come from one of their responses and it may be really important for you to ask it. You want to make sure you catch that. And by asking questions of all these types, you have the greatest chance to be able to reach those particular targets. So an open-ended question is all about the what, how, and why. It's designed to get very, very simple answers to very, very simple questions, but they are also not a yes and no answer. They are about describing the specifics about a situation. So in the case of someone who has worked with cross-functional teams or teams across multiple teams and multiple functions in an organization, you may ask, what experience have you had managing cross-functional teams? The answer they can give is not just a yes, I have experience. They have to answer with specific cases where they had this experience. So it could be something, for instance, where they said, yes, I've had experience with managing cross-functional teams through across a software development project. And in this software development project, we found that there was people who were in areas that weren't really made to be in teams. There are people who are more likely due to be working as solos from home. And particularly during COVID-19, these peoples really show that they weren't part of the team and were a little bit more difficult to manage. So what we had to do is bring them back into the office and make them more of a cross-functional team with people working beside them again. So that's great. That's a full, complete, comprehensive answer to a question rather than a yes, I did or no, I didn't. The how question can be in the form of how were you able to make the move to management so quickly? And that question can be answered, it can't be answered with a yes, I moved to management quickly or no, I didn't. It actually requires some explanation. It requires going a little bit further than yes or no or black and white. So the answer to how were you able to move so quickly in the management could be simply because there was a lot of natural attrition going on in that workplace. And it came up very quickly that within 3 months, I was the most experienced person on the floor. And I literally had to step into that role and sink or swim because everybody coming after me was less experienced, less qualified. And even though I'd only been there 3 months, I was the person who was most experienced and qualified, and thankfully have been given comprehensive training and the processes so I knew how to then train these people. That's a much more comprehensive answer than yes, I moved quickly from being on the floor to being in a management position. Then the why question can be in something in the form of, why do you think that your colleagues initially made it difficult for you to fit in? That we're looking for qualitative answers here, not for quantity. We're not looking for performance. We're not looking for a brag here. We're looking for reasons. We're looking for that person to be able to show some degree of thought and critical thinking so that they can come back with an idea of, you know, the why, the behind the reasons why this thing actually happened. So an answer that might be quite valid to this question, why do you think your colleagues initially made it difficult for you to fit in, could be that the person who previously held my role at that company was there for 33 years. She was loved. She was part of the family. When she finally did retire, she left a massive gap, and that was very hard for people who have been together in a very stable team for a long time to be able to step across from having this person to this next person who is largely an unknown quantity. They didn't know, they hadn't learned to trust yet, and they had some difficulty with that. And over time, it took me time. It took turning up every day to work and being consistent and being truthful and being honest and inspiring trust to be able to finally get people to the point where they could trust me and know what they wanted out of me. That's a great comprehensive answer to a great comprehensive question. So it allows people to answer back with qualitative responses that allow them to properly explain what their thought processes are and to be honest and transparent about any of those things that may show up as gaps in their resume or gaps in their experience at all. Now we move on to a second type of question, the self-appraisal question. This is where the person will analyze their own performance. Your candidate then could be asked a question like, what were some of those challenges and how did you overcome them that are in a particular workforce or a work case or a scenario? So if you're asking what the challenges were, this person then has to go back and actually analyze their own behavior and analyze their own performance and come back with an answer they think would be suitable for this new role. So someone may answer that question, what were some of the challenges and how did you overcome them? They will say, initially the challenge was being able to simply get to that workplace on time every day. The traffic was very, 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 inconsistent. Some days it was longer than others. So I had to overcome that simply by leaving 15 minutes earlier than what I would normally do. Now, it may get me there 15 minutes early, but that's fine. That gave me time to read a book, but it ensured I was there on time. Another answer to that, what were some of the challenges and how do you overcome them, could be, I simply sat down with the people involved and who I had a problem with. And I said, look, I know I'm not her. I know I'm not replacing her and I never could, but I'm the person you've got here right now. And what you're doing is making my life really hard. It means so much easier for me if we do that. If we can understand, I'm not trying to be her. I'm trying to be me. I'm trying to do a great job here. And I really need your help to do that. So that can show that there's a great deal of emotional intelligence and a little bit of fearlessness in that person as well. A second question could be, did you feel that the way that you handled the situation was the best way to have handled it? Now, this is not so much an open question because they could say yes or no in here, but the question itself being quite pointed to a specific incident or a specific scenario opens it up to more explanation. So, asking the question, did you feel that the way you handled that situation was the best way to have handled it? An answer could come in the form of, to be honest, I could have done better. I could have got to this problem, got to the core of this problem a lot earlier, but instead I did let this stew for quite a while. And what it did, it created a bit of a culture overcoming over the weeks prior that allowed people to think they could treat me in a certain way. Unfortunately, I had to be very strong and very, very firm in the time when I did approach people because I'd let them get away with it for so long that they had kind of thought it was okay. So when I suddenly turned this around, it was very confusing and disorienting for them. Clearly, these people did need a lot of sensitivity training and a lot more emotional intelligence in the way they approach people. But I too could have stepped forward a lot earlier to nip this problem in the bud before it became a problem. What you're doing there is opening the door for someone to, yes, answer that question directly, but provide the context of how they actually handled that situation, not just looking at whether they handled it well or they didn't. Another question is, what was that one thing that you thought that you could have done much better at? This is a really good thing because this is these kind of things which they say that it immediately takes people out of the promotional circle. I think that old-fashioned question of what's the asking a question such as, so what do you think your greatest weakness is? And someone will say, oh, I think I just work too hard. And I think that's what the boss wants to hear. We all know that that's a really stupid question now to ask because it opens up to an equally stupid answer to come from someone. It's so predictable what someone's going to say. I think I care too much. I think I work too hard. They think those questions are going to help them get across the line when they actually are quite disingenuous and dishonest as well. So answering the question, what was the one thing that you thought that you could have done much better at, opens up the door to some questions such as, I could have approached that staff member with a lot more care and compassion. I walked into it just seeing how I was hurt rather than seeing where they may have been coming from. And therefore, it made it a lot more of a difficult conversation than it really had to be. It didn't have to be quite as yelly. It didn't have to be quite as aggressive as it was. If I just had have approached it from a point where I say, this person is broken and made a mistake, I need to help them to unmake that mistake and to feel a little less broken, rather than just me coming from my brokenness and saying, yeah, you know what? I'm broken, I'm hurt, I just want to lash out. So that gives you the opportunity to understand not only that, yes, there's one thing they could have done better, but they explain in far more detail what that one thing was. It also allows them to see whether their lack of performance or their poor performance in the past actually has contributed to a better performance now, a better approach to situations than what they had before. Accomplishment questions come in the form of the ability for them to just demonstrate experience in very practical work situations. So whilst they're not there necessarily doing the job and doing it in front of you, they should be able to adequately explain how they worked through normal everyday work situations. These questions can be in the form of something like, what specific responsibilities did you have in your previous role? They can't just say, oh, I worked at the front desk. That was what I was meant to do. They have to go a little bit further into it by just saying, well, I worked in the front desk, makes someone look like an idiot, makes them look like they just haven't really even thought about it. And if they thought so poorly of that previous role, they may think poorly about your role that you're about to give them as well. So to answer the question, what specific responsibilities did you have in your previous role? A good answer could be something like, on the front desk, I was responsible for being the first point of contact for everyone walking in. So I had to be consistently producing the results of being friendly, approachable, and easy to communicate with. But also, I was a place where calls to the hotel came in, and I had to answer those calls in a consistent manner whilst also managing people coming in the front door. Now, naturally, whilst people at the reception desk were a higher priority, I also had to let people on the phone know that I will be with them shortly. I'm just serving someone at the front desk, so they know there's a reason. This then is a good answer because it shows that they are knowing that there are complexities in that role and how they actually handle those complexities. You can see an insight into how they've done things that you may want them to do next previously in the role where they've done that correctly or have had challenges come up that they then explain to you. By asking someone, what was your part in the overall project? You're asking them to explain, not really just justify and say, well, yeah, I was part of the team. They actually explain what their nuts and bolts part of that team was. So what it is instead of saying, what was your part in the overall project? Oh, yes, I was the project manager. They have to say, well, as the project manager, I had to develop really good working relationship with every one of the developments officers and engineers that were working on that project, and then understand that they had problems and needs as well, that they had pressures on them coming from multiple directions, and I had to use my relationship skills with them to ensure that I was getting the work done for this project that I really needed to get done. So it was prioritized, not always over their other work, but certainly it was prioritized as part of their list of work they'd have to do each day. Now, that is a far better answer than I was the project manager. It's a way of explaining where they came from as a project manager. In that case, the answer was somebody who had very, very naturally leaned towards the relationships they had to build with people to get the work done, rather than the logistics of, well, I had to keep things running to a budget and I had to keep things running to a schedule. They went straight for the people side because that's how they believe they were able to achieve the things they were able to achieve. So what you've done then is help them to expand on their human skills, not just on their project management skills. Another question is, how were you able to add your own skills and experience to the team's success? In this case, you can answer it with, through my background in psychology, I was able to approach people with a lot more empathy and a lot more open-ended questions that enabled me to get more of the information I needed in order to get the work done. And by the experience of having done this before with so many other organizations, I knew that sometimes when people tell you, what's happening in their workflow, that they're not always honest. So I knew how to ask the right questions in order to get the right answers out of them and give them a safe place to admit that sometimes they were just plain overwhelmed. Now, this also is the kind of answer that gives someone the opportunity to express how to creatively approach a situation rather than just saying, I did this and this is how I did it. They're saying, actually, because of this background I had with this, I knew to do this. And because I'd done the experience of that, I knew to then approach that with this kind of approach and was able to get me through the problem in the end, or maybe not get through the problem. Either way, you see the thinking process of someone and you understand how they can link things they've done in the past with things they're now doing in the present or are planning to do with you in the future. Broad brush questions then are all about the big picture and not the specifics. This is how people can understand where they're coming from a much bigger point of view. So it's opinions, and it could be calls that you want them to make on very large questions, things that are not generally going to be in the day to day, but could give you an overall attitude of how they may work with your organization and be compatible with the kind of approach you're taking in your organization. So a question could be something like, what can you tell me about managing offshore assistance? So you're not telling them, you're asking them to tell you whether you hate it or you love it. You're saying, what do you know about managing offshore assistance? And that question could be, I've learned through my experience with offshore assistance that you're better off working with a team that's already in place rather than trying to set up just an individual on your own. Because I found that when people are working in the Philippines, when they need to work from home, they don't actually have a dedicated space in the home to work from. So they have to make do with working in local cafes, using local internet in the street, going to friends' houses. So you get an inconsistency of workplace. What these offshore assistants need is a place to go and work so that they can get all the things they need to do that job without being bothered by the minutiae of daily life. That is an incredible view of what someone has. And it shows that not only have they known something in theory, but they seem to have had a very, very specific situation that brought that through, which shows them that not only do they have a general knowledge of something, but they've got very hands-on knowledge of that particular topic as well. A second question, what's the most challenging thing about working with customers on social media? Now, an answer to that you'll be looking for is not something like, well, because you can't see them, you can't really get a feel for who they are. You're looking for something more like, well, the thing about customers on social media is that they're usually looking for a very immediate response. And if they don't get that immediate response, they can get a lot more angry than they can get even when they're in the shop. In shops, we've been kind of expected that there's more people to serve than people who are there to serve them. So we're used to having to wait in line. We used to have to wait for attention, look for spare staff and all that. But online, we're used to bots and things answering us straight away. So it's made the customer a lot less patient and a lot less willing to actually wait for someone to respond. So if we send back and say, someone will be with you in 5 minutes, that person's already gone off and has started chatting to another person. That's a great answer that shows a lot of insight and a lot of personal experience with something, and having a very strong opinion that's formed by real experience, not just from having someone go, well, this is what I was thinking I was doing, and this is what I heard someone say. They're going with a real world experience. It shows you a depth and a well-rounded view of a particular situation, like what's so challenging about working with customers on social media. Then you want to look at what your opinion is on the effect of grants and the ability for small business to stand on its own over time. So this is something that's asking quite a very big question about something which is quite philosophical in nature. It's saying, you're not saying definitely that grants actually make it harder for a small business to stand on its own over time. And you're not saying that necessarily your business is dependent upon grants. You're just saying, what do you think the effect is of grants on the ability for small businesses to stand on their own over a longer period of time? So coming back with you'll be looking for someone to not necessarily come back with a very strong opinion, but an informed opinion. They may come back and say, and this is just as valid an answer as any, I've actually not really been involved in their businesses that have been subject to getting many grants. So I can't really speak definitely to having a strong opinion on the ability of them to stand on their own over time. However, I would think that if a business becomes too dependent on grants, that when those grants disappear, they'll find it very difficult to stand on their own, and that they having that strong dependence on one source of income for any business is going to make it really hard for them to survive in the hard times when those sources of income may disappear. What that candidate is then doing with an answer like that is they're showing that not only do they have an opinion, but they have well thought that out, even on their feet. And these big questions like this, these big picture questions, also provide you with an opportunity to not only get specific answers to questions, but to get someone to think on their feet. The idea that they can think very quickly on a particular topic that they may not have prepared themselves for, but they can very quickly get into that topic and speak to it like an absolute pro as well. And that's what ultimately you want people to do. You want them to be able to show their expertise, but also show how willing and able they are to step into topics that they weren't really necessarily sure that they'd be qualified or capable of speaking on. So broad brush questions can be really, really like a powerful way for you to understand how to get the best out of someone, not just the carbon copy, cookie cutter answers that people like to give when they're talking to people in authority into an interview situation. And then there's also comparison questions. So this is where you look at, how someone may have worked in the past or how they may be expected to work into the future. This tells you how they think and how they can express themselves given a choice between two things. Now, the choice they make here isn't as important as how they express it. This gives you an insight into someone's personality. You may ask, how would you compare leading a team to being a team member? And the obvious answer that someone may give to that is something, well, when you're leading the team, you tend to be paid more than the team members, which is really lazy thinking. You want to look for someone who wants to go into, well, when you're leading a team, you're taking a lot more responsibility. It's like your own personal result is not as important as your team's result, because your team's individual results add up to a certain code. That means that, you are judged upon that. So instead of being judged on your ability to do the work, you're judged more on your ability to drive a team and see their success come to fruition. That's a much better way for someone to answer than simply, well, team leaders get paid more. It shows a lack of critical thinking if someone answers like that. But more importantly, it shows that they've never really considered what the broader perspective is of the difference between being a worker and being a manager, showing they probably don't have the chops to really go forward and be in management material, leadership material. You could ask then, how is it different working for a big business and a small business? Now, an easy answer would be big businesses have more money and more money to spend, so it's going to be a lot easier to get what you need. But working for a small business is, harder to get what you need. That could be a very lazy answer. What we're looking for here is some sort of insight into what they have noticed when their prior work between larger and smaller businesses. Now, bear in mind, not everyone would have worked in a small or a big business, but this question really helps bring out that creativity. Again, that thinking on the feet. How is it different working for a big business and a small business? Well, in a big business, you could walk past 30 people and they wouldn't know who you are. But in a small business, everyone knows your name and they know what you're up to, which is one thing, I guess, that means that you get to build very tight relationships with people in small businesses. But my experience in big businesses too, you build equally tight experiences with your team members, but you may not be as tight with those people who work on another floor who you don't see very often. So it also feels like, a big business is really just like a collection of small little teams or small little businesses of their own. So in many ways, they're much the same, except that maybe when you need to get something done, you may need to pay people, spend a lot more time getting that done in a big business, where you can go often in a small business straight to the boss and get the answer you need. Another question could be, what do you have to consider when working with big budgets as opposed to small budgets? The lazy answer will be something like, well, there's more money to go around, so you can spend more and more, get it more easily. The more clear answer will be something that shows that they've really thought this through. They've really shown that they've got some sort of perspective or creative thinking around this when they say, well, the problem with big budgets is you tend to spend a little bit more indiscriminately. You'll go with things that you feel are safe because you know you're reporting to someone about that. But when you're working with a small budget, you tend to be, only really accountable yourself and your immediate boss. So what you've got is, you've got an opportunity to be more creative and to go that little bit further to see what you can get for free, what you can get cheap, and what the things are you need to spend that big amount of money on. Whereas a budget of $1,000 as opposed to a budget of $100,000 just simply means you have to go a bit more creative with your solutions and look for not the obvious result, but the result that may be a little bit more hidden in order to get a great service out of some company that may be normally wanting to deal with much larger budgets. So you want to see that someone can think on their feet and consider differences between one world and another world. Now we come to doing the actual interview. And in the actual interview, you want to reduce the stress for everyone involved. You want to follow some kind of routine that helps to ensure that the experience is as comfortable as possible. The very old school way of holding an interview, which is to make people squirm in their seats so you can squeeze out the best from them. Honestly, unless you're interviewing for the military, or for a very military position or a very adversarial position in a very aggressive company, then you probably need to get a bit more chilled out and calm hell down and make it an experience that is actually quite pleasant for everyone involved, because stressful interviews don't really help anyone out. Not you, not they. Remember, they're interviewing you just at the same time as you're interviewing them. So the routine would involve you being on time. And I'm talking about you, not them. They should be on time too, but you should always be on time, because that shows that you have respect for them. There's nothing worse than going to the doctor's office and you've made an appointment for 2 p.m. and at 2:45, you're still waiting to be served in that doctor's office because they have all sorts of priorities and reasons why they have to sort of shove you back all the time when your problem isn't quite as important as everyone else's. That said, that isn't explained to you. It's just expected that you'll accept it because they're the great and powerful doctors, and you're just a mug punter who's gone into their surgery, into their clinic to get looked at. Be on time. It shows respect for their time. It shows that you respect your time, and it shows that you have a certain level of efficiency. That means that your business can be trusted to be around for them, not just them being around for you. Starting with an icebreaker before breaking straight into your questions is a great way for everyone to get to know each other. That icebreaker could be in the form of introducing each other, answering and saying, okay, what we'd like you to do before you answer these sort of our inbound questions. I'd love to know, what did you get up to on the weekend? Or I noticed in your resume before we get underway that you do a lot of swimming. Where do you usually swim at? What it does, it gets someone feeling like they have some level of rapport. And when people feel like they've got rapport, they feel more comfortable and they're willing to open up a lot easily with you as well. So starting with that icebreaker means that you're giving someone the opportunity to come forward with personality rather than that cookie cutter responses they may be tempted to go and fall back on. Ask questions and then let them answer. So what you do, you ask a question, then you shut up. Don't try to answer it for them. Don't go, I guess, did you grow up in Sydney? Yeah, you grew up in Sydney, didn't you? So, you'd know all about how much more competitive it could be. What you brought to say, so you grew up in Sydney, yeah? And you go, yeah, I did actually. I'm in the southwestern part of Sydney around Campbelltown. Oh, great. Okay. Did that like sort of make you a very competitive person? And then you ask them, Okay, then that gets them thinking more creatively than simply like, yes, I grew up in Sydney. No, I did not grow up in Sydney. Yes, I grew up in Melbourne. Yes, I grew up in Adelaide. No, I didn't grow up in Melbourne or Adelaide. It lets them look at the qualities of where they come from that helped form the person they are today. If some of those questions go way off track, and sometimes they honestly will, they'll go so far off track that you will not understand in the slightest on how to bring it back. Just steer it back to the topic at hand when needed, and actually be open with it. Say, wow, we just got really, really off topic there. I'm going to bring it back to the questions, otherwise we'll never get through them. And that's when you just laugh at it a bit yourself. It shows them that you have a sense of humor. You also are fairly casual in your approach, but you're still firm enough to go from something that goes right off track to bringing it back to the question. That will inspire confidence in the person you're interviewing. They understand that if that's what you're like in an interview, you're probably like that with work as well, where you're able to keep them on track. Because let's face it, most of us are not really good at doing that ourselves. Also, be transparent around those potential issues. If a question and answers come up which feels a little awkward, address that elephant in the room and be transparent about it and say, look, I have a concern about the way that you answered about why you moved around a lot, and it just sort of indicates there might be a bit of a problem with instability there. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but it may affect our ability to be able to sort of trust you with higher level jobs when they come up in the future. So, can you just clarify for me when you say you moved around for relationships? Was that for new relationships, or was it for the fact that your husband had to move around a lot? That could give you an idea, an insight into something that could be a potential issue that may not be able to be overcome by that employee. Some pitfalls though you may not want to fall into when it comes to doing an interview stage is don't be too quick to form an opinion about a person based upon one answer to one question. Just because they may have mentioned something you don't necessarily philosophically agree with, or just because they might have mentioned, something political or religious or personal, don't be quick to form an opinion that they are an oversharer, because they may have just been just slightly caught out on that one particular question they needed to work around, and that they may have not been ready for the question, or they may have just answered it a bit sooner than they had a chance to answer it. Then also look at experience and performance only tell part of the story. So when I say only tell part of the story, what we're saying is that that it only, excuse me, it only tells part of the story that they may have necessarily prepared for. The part of the story they want to go on, yes, you know what, that's the bit I can do. I can't get beyond that. So that tells you that the experience and their performance analysis of what they've done in the past isn't all of them. There is more to that story. And that quite honestly comes up in a lot of their questions that you may ask around the things they're interested in, the extracurricular things they do outside of work. They can be a really good insight into finding out more about that person and their approach to work, even though they may not seem like work related questions. Quiet and reserved people aren't uninterested. Just because someone's quiet and reserved and hard to answer questions with doesn't mean they're a bad person, and it doesn't mean they're not interested in the role. They may be hugely nervous. They may be feeling a power dynamic that's making it difficult for them to answer those questions. You don't know what private battles people are going through. Doesn't necessarily make them bad workers. It just means that maybe, you know what, it's going to take me a while for that person to warm to me, just like it's going to take me a while to warm to them. Check your biases on race, gender, religion, sexuality, all of those things. You got to make sure you check on those biases, because when you walk in with biases, you also walk in with stereotypes. And where stereotypes say, well, all women are emotional, all men are cold-hearted bastards, all people from this particular background, they're nasty and horrible, and they just want to kill everybody. That's when you walk in with those stereotypes and biases, the interview might as well be over. The problem isn't that person on the other end of the table. The problem is you, and you need to address that immediately. When it comes to assessing after the interview, that's when you need to look and think beyond the obvious. Your assessment is about more than just their job history and more than just their skills and experience and expertise. It's about the things that, are a bit less obvious. Things like the fact that 90% of communication is not verbal. Words are not the only answer to the question. Your body language and your physical cues say a lot. Now, your candidate may have terrible body language like this, not really want to talk to anyone, feeling really, really awkward, and not really want to answer a question. That is going to say a lot to you about the kind of person they are. They are just someone who's going to they're going to struggle a fair bit. Body language and physical cues also say a lot about you as a potential employer. If you're someone who comes across authoritarian, sitting higher than everybody, or sitting across a very, very long table with someone at the other end, it means that you want to be as hands-off with that person as possible. And that may mean that they don't react very well to that. Also look at emotional triggers. These should be noted. Critical thinking also says a lot about how people operate, and a positive attitude says as much about their answer as what their basic skills and experience would indicate. Body language can be things like his mouth is saying yes, but his arms are saying no. Notice how seating position can change when a question is asked that is a bit more probing. Watch for narrowing eyes that indicate that someone doesn't quite understand something. Watch for twitching and fidgeting. It can be a sign of discomfort, nerves, or also neurodiversity. Someone could have, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. They may have autism. They may have any variety of different conditions that show that they are neurodiverse, which means that you need to bear in mind that this person isn't untrusted because they twitch. They might just have a neurological condition that makes them do that. Triggers and emotional intelligence shows that that you understand that not everybody is like you. Be aware of how someone identifies themselves. Do they introduce themselves with their pronouns, saying, my name is Taylor, my pronouns are they, them, and theirs, which allows you to then have the opportunity to refer to them as them, not as her or him, but as them. Using pronouns may seem like one of those ridiculous modern things. I know it's hard and it's difficult to do it, but it shows respect for the person across the table. It's not about what you think. It isn't. It's actually about what they think. Remember, they're interviewing you. You're not just interviewing them. Watching for awkward moments around cultural references and voice tone can also tell you a lot about what someone's background is, remembering that your background wasn't necessarily their background. The TV shows you grew up with are not necessarily the TV shows they grew up with. The drinking culture that you grew up with may not be the drinking culture that they grew up with. And understand that inclusive language and how to approach diverse people means that you are a far better employer with a far better range of possibilities to employ people, not just who get you and are a cultural fit, because cultural fit is usually built to mean that as long as we want to hire people who are just like everyone else who's here so they fit in. That is just a cop out that just says basically I want to hire white people who are men. It's a cop out, and it's just not acceptable. You've got to understand that to grow your business, to be selling to more people from culturally diverse backgrounds, you need to have people in your business who are from culturally diverse backgrounds to help better serve those people as well. So understand that you need to get past those stereotypes, get past those biases, and get past what's been easy for you to do, and understand that the world's a different place now, and that you need to be different and approach it much more openly as well. For critical thinking, we want to understand that somebody has self-awareness of their own strengths and their own challenges. This shows emotional and psychological and intellectual maturity. Being unable to provide clear answers to clear questions shows that there's a lack of critical thinking ability. If someone's got a very strong opinion on something but can't back that up, that means they don't have the ability to access another point of view and provide a clear response. That shows that they're just not a clear critical thinker at all. If someone can do that, if they can look at things from another person's point of view and perspective, and then provide an adequate, clear conversational point to it, then that shows they're a critical thinker and they go beyond just automatic thinking. So to wrap it all up, conducting successful interviews requires that you definitely be prepared. Create your list of questions and topics to walk in so that the person on the other end understands that you know what you're doing as well. You can also make sure that you're asking the right types of questions, making sure you're covering all those different kinds of questions, from open-ended questions through to broad brush questions, something that's going to get different sides of that person out and understand what their process of thinking is so that you can get some great understanding from them. Then you also want to make sure you gather the necessary information about the candidate from their resume. Going into the interview, have a quick scan over it before they come into the door, making sure that you're refreshed on who they are and your brain is all connected up and you're ready to ask the appropriate questions for that candidate based upon the information they've already provided to you. Also, assessing the applicant based on their skills and experience is ultimately important. You have your must-haves and you have your mandatory inclusions they must have in their past and their future and their work history and their qualifications. Yes, but you also need to assess on attitude, emotional intelligence, and importantly, critical thinking, so you can have the best possible employer-employee relationship that you can possibly have. I'd like to thank you for joining me this afternoon. If you're watching this on YouTube, whack a comment below and hit that subscribe button, maybe even the bell too, in order to make sure you get these new webinars when they do come out, whether that's on my channel under Dante St. James or under the Business Station channel. You'll find us both on YouTube. If you want to know more about the ASBAS Digital Solutions Program, go to businessstation.com.au and you can register. The program is running out at the end of June, so you've got some limited time with which to take advantage of all these webinars, workshops, and one-to-one advisory services as well. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd love to see you over there. In the meantime, though, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have an amazing week and that your next hiring situation is a lot more smooth than the ones you've had in the past. Happy hiring.